So let me get to the, let me make sure I have the right screen share here. Hold on a second. There we go. All right. So I was checking a little bit of what we did last time. And one of the things that came up in our discussion is the whole term Tanakh, right? Which is an acronym that in Hebrew for Hebrew scriptures. I made a note to myself to do that, to discuss that. But let me make the bracha first because I haven't done that. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
See what's going on here. There we go. So, Tanakh. It's an acronym that stands for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. Torah, prophets, and writings. So the Torah consists of the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The prophets start with Joshua and go through to, I think, I'm not sure if it's Malachi, I believe is the last of the prophets. And so it includes Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel are 3 major prophets, and then there, I believe, 12 minor prophets. And they're called minor because their books are quite relatively short compared to Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And they span quite a few centuries. I think Amos and Hosea are one of the earliest, or 2 of the earliest ones. And Malachi, Haggai, and Zechariah all are during the period of the first exile. So that prophetic period lasted quite a long time. And of course, we also have those are called literary prophets. Preceding that are the books that start off with Joshua, Judges, Samuel 1, Samuel 2, Kings 1, and Kings 2. They conclude stories about prophets as well, but they're the non-literary prophets because they did not leave books themselves. And then following that is something called the writings, which consists of Psalms, Proverbs, Job, and other similar kinds of writings, the 5 Megillot, for example, and those are the third part, the writings. By the way, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, they're all included in that writing section. So why, of course, this begs a question, which is why a tripartite division? And I think there are 2 reasons that I can come up with as to why. One has to do, the first and perhaps the most important reason, but I'll let you be the judge, has to do with the nature of the revelation. That is to say that the revelation that the 5 books of Moses reflect is a direct revelation, and the way it's expressed, of course, is that God actually dictated every word in these 5 books to Moses. And then, of course, in the prophets, we have another level of revelation, which is not a word for word. It's not a dictation, but rather the inspiration that God gave these prophets in this prophetic setting to write down the words that they wrote. And they do quote God in many cases, but in that case, the Torah itself, by the way, excuse me, one second. Talks about the nature of how unique Moses' revelation is, in that he hears God's voice just like we're having a direct speech, whereas with other prophets, it comes in a vision or a dream, and that's where they hear God's voice speaking. It's not direct speech. So that's a lower level of divine inspiration, of revelation. And the third section, the writings, basically represents the writings of very devout, holy people, not necessarily quoting God, although I will tell you that in the book of Daniel, he does mention this, but the book of Daniel was written outside the land of Israel. It was written in Babylonia, and there's some significance to the fact that that revelation wasn't given in the land of Israel, which has a special level of sanctity. So that's one explanation as to why this 3-way division. So a second explanation that I would offer you is that the first 5 books have specific commandments. The commandments are very specific. We're told to build a sukkah. We're told to celebrate Pesach in specific ways. There are many specific laws, and we consider that an amazing privilege that we have divine law, that we are able to, that somehow we can connect to the source of creation and find a way in which to behave, in which to make choices that are wise, etc. And of course, in that sense, we talk about the Torah being a light because it lights up our path so that we don't stumble in the dark as we try to negotiate life itself. And then when you go to the prophets, they tend to discuss, at least certainly the literary prophets, tend to talk more in terms of faith in general, not so much in terms of specific mitzvot, but what it is to be a faithful person and to accept God as your God, as your divine commander, but without so much specific commandments. And the non-literary prophets there's a lot of narrative there, similar to what you find in Genesis. So again, even though they're not literary in the sense that they don't, the words of Isaiah, presumably the book of Isaiah were written by Isaiah, the books of these other books, the non-literary prophets are not necessarily, they're written about these people, not necessarily by these people. And again, just like in the book of Genesis, I believe, just like in any good literature, you find a level of understanding, a deeper understanding of what it is to be a human being and to understand what human life is about. And so, in a very similar sense, those books have good examples, they have bad examples, but essentially they're there to give us a deeper understanding and a knowledge. They are rather historical in nature, and there are times when you know that I'll describe the Torah and certainly other parts of the Bible sort of like a historical novel. But the understanding of the way in which literature can express truth that goes beyond, let's say, a historical approach is profound. And then what about the writings? So the writings, of course, the book of Psalms is essentially in a prayer modality, and it has to do with the way in which, I would say another way of putting this was the way in which human beings reach out to the divine. And so you have these amazing prayers that cover a whole span of emotions and situations, etc., in the book of Psalms. In the book of Proverbs, you have great wisdom being shared as to how to make these choices and how to avoid the pitfalls of life. The book of Job, of course, deals with the issue of what's called theodicy, meaning the fact that a righteous person can have to endure tremendous adversity, and the arguments about that and that go into it. My main takeaway from the book of Job, and it's a difficult book, is what's interesting is that the arguments on the part of his friends are not bad arguments. They're very intelligent arguments. The problem is that they miss the point. And we have this term, you may have heard it, being Job's friend. Well, friend would have to be in quotation marks, because they basically come to try to rationalize to Job why this is happening to him, and because he isn't perfect, etc., etc. And I think there's a very important message being given in that book, which is that there's an existential place, meaning that when you come to comfort someone, explaining to them why this is happening to them because they aren't perfect isn't a help at all. Isn't a help at all. And in fact, Job has to, in the end, pray to God to forgive his friends for what they did, and this kind of approach to things. And so it could be that the book of Job is a critique of that kind of approach to religion. Is there a question?
I've
Yes.
heard it expressed most commonly as Job's comforters,
Yes, you're right. That's
which is,
another
of
way.
course,
Yeah,
not comforting.
correct. It's not. Telling someone why this happened to them in this sort of rational kind of way is just unhelpful. And not only that, it's painful. It's painful. to make someone feel that they're to blame for their suffering is not the way to talk to someone. It just isn't. That's not where they're at. And trying to give a person confidence and a comfort, etc. That's really what we have to do, and not to rationalize these situations.
The other question I have about Tanakh
Mhm.
is that the Christian Old Testament has the same 39 books, but
Yes.
in chronological order, or supposedly chronological order. Like
Yes.
Kings is followed by Chronicles, for
Right.
example.
Right.
And I'm wondering how that happened. I never knew.
Okay.
I never really looked into it. But my understanding was is that those were um, that that they were that Tanakh is also in the order of canonization, but that that made sense intellectually, but doesn't make sense in terms of this is all you know God's divine word, and how would
Mhm.
somebody
Mhm.
somebody admit it happened in sections?
Mm. Well, whoever ultimately was responsible for presenting the Bible or the Hebrew scriptures to us clearly chose the order in which, and some of it has to do with canonization is not a bad answer. Um, I will tell you that the Book of Chronicles is not part of the prophets. The Book of Chronicles is part of the writings. In fact, of course, it's the final two books of the Tanakh. And that's because, again, it has to do with a level of authority as well, divine authority. The last book in the Christian scriptures, version of our Hebrew scriptures, is Malachi. And if you look at the last sentences of the prophet Malachi, he talks about the prophet Elijah and how Elijah is going to come at the end of days, or at least at some point, Elijah is going to show up. And in trying to deal with the authenticity of the Christian approach to religion, the prophet Elijah is identified with John the Baptist. So it's a way of Christians trying to say that there's a seamless transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And that's why the specific order of Christian scriptures. And that's I believe the reason why they end with the prophet Malachi, specifically for that reason. And part of the difficulty there is, Christianity represents a movement away from mitzvot, of divine commandments. That whole, in other words, at least early Christianity raises the issue of what's called nomianism. A nomianistic belief is one that believes in divine law. That is to say, that God cares about specific behaviors that human beings have. And in the book of Acts in the New Testament, it's sort of basically stated that this is not something that is of concern to God, that God is more concerned about one's character and being faithful in a general kind of way. In fact, they take passages from Genesis about Abraham and how he believed in God and things like that, to show that that's really what God wants, and God is unconcerned about specific laws. So interestingly enough, both Judaism and Islam are nomianistic religions, because they both sense that part of the relationship that we have with God has to do with the willingness to serve God in very specific kinds of ways. And Christianity moved away from that, especially under the influence of Paul. Paul was, of course, he never himself knew Jesus, but he was a tremendous, tremendous influence in spreading the words of the gospel and spreading the belief in the church, etc. And he actually is critical of those new Christians that felt they wanted to start to practice commandments. And he refers to them as Judaizers in a critical kind of way. So, there's this base. So the question now is, when did God change his mind, right? And so there's some issues of authenticity. that Christianity needs to answer. I don't personally feel that there's any need for critiques here, but at any rate, having that relatively seamless move from our Tanakh to the New Testament would be part of a support that, in fact, this was what God decided. And in some ways, on the other side, there's the rejection, the idea of the Jews not being faithful to God, not practicing properly, etc., etc. And consequently, second, 1 second, Micah, I'm in a class. I'm so sorry. I'll talk to you later. Thanks. Okay, talk to you later. Bye-bye. I should have. Okay. So, and now I have to kind of think of where I was at. Oh, yeah. So the idea that the reason for a quote New Testament was that God had rejected the Jewish people, that they were not worthy of having this relationship of the chosen people anymore. So, I mean, that's historical, and it's there, and one has to obviously deal with it, and to make out of it what is helpful and what helps us understand better. I don't believe there's as much competition between Christianity and Judaism, but sadly, of course, you have the basis you can understand of anti-Semitism within Christianity, and of course things like the Spanish Inquisition, etc., etc. And to my mind, this is, if I may, if there's more to discuss, we can discuss it. But my sense is that one of the greatest heroes, in my personal opinion, is Pope John the 23rd. And that's because of his great, I think it's called an encyclical, I'm not certain, but Vatican II, it's referred to that, where basically he denied the idea that Jews and Judaism was rejected, and that it wasn't a legitimate way to worship God. And he did incredible things. And by the way, he himself personally saved Jews during the Holocaust. That he wasn't Pope at the time. He had a very minor position, but in Europe and Eastern Europe, and I believe, and saved many Jews. Used his. So I think for me, he is just one of the greatest heroes of the 20th century. So, any questions or comments at this point before we go into the text itself? Okay.
I was wondering, Rabbi, God spoke to Adam and Eve directly. He spoke to Cain directly. He spoke to Abraham directly. He spoke to Moses directly. And after that, he didn't speak to anybody except in their dreams. Now, what I'm trying to find out is, do we have a prophet in the 21st century, a minor or major now?
Okay, so first of all, I want to suggest that even though the text itself sounds like God is speaking directly to Adam and Eve and Abraham, etc., etc., there's no reason why we would say that they weren't in a different spiritual state than Moses. It's very clear about that. Okay, and you're asking several things, making several points here. So it's because it's in the form of this narrative, this literature, and that's why it's expressed in the way that it's expressed. And the other piece, of course, is that Moses receives specific laws, and the others don't in the same way. Even though Noah has the Noahide laws, but we have to say that however they were transmitted, it wasn't in the same way that Moses received Torah. We consider Moses to be one of a kind in terms of all the prophets. Now, to answer your second issue about prophets in the 21st century, basically, we do not have prophets in the same sense that existed, that are reflected in the book, in the section of the Torah called the prophets. We don't. But on the other hand, there's a couple of reasons. One reason is that we have the Torah, we have the Bible. If we want prophecy, if we want to know the nature of prophecy, then we just have to open up a Bible. And the Bible, of course, is printed in how many languages? It's very, you can get hold of it very easily. It's not a difficulty. It's not up in heaven. Okay, so that's one thing. Another piece, though, is that there are people even now. So we're going through this book by Heschel, right? For example, and in some ways, here he is writing, I think, in the 50s, perhaps, maybe a little later, but not much later. And this is quite a while ago. And you read what he has to say, and you realize that in some ways it's prophetic, in the sense that he is talking about human foibles, he is talking about human spiritual mistakes, etc., or thinking in a way that is not really representative of reality. And in that sense, Heschel is a prophet, but not in the, I still would claim that he's a prophet in the way that Isaiah, Ezekiel, etc., were prophets. But we have the material. If we want to, our purpose isn't to become prophets. That's not the idea. In fact, there's a statement in the tradition that says that when the Israelites had to go through the 40 years of wandering, Moses received no revelation at all. That the basis on which a prophet gets revelation isn't for personal gain or personal benefit. It has to do with the need of God to communicate to the Jewish people. So that's already with regards to Moses. And so it helps us understand better the whole idea of what prophecy is about. Okay. All right. So we'll just do a teeny bit here. So Rashi, of course, has all this to say about the Bereshit. In fact, we haven't even finished all this and a little bit more Rashi has to say about this opening sentence of the Bible and the Torah. So this is where we left off the last time, Bereshit bara. So in the beginning, he created, or maybe not. At any rate, because this word Bereshit is a problematic word. It is a problematic word. And Rashi is going to use the tools of grammar to be able to explain exactly what it's trying to say. Give me one moment. Okay. Let me go back in here. So, Ein hamikra hazeh omer ella darshuni. So this scriptural trace, the mikra means a scriptural verse. This verse only says, explain me. That's literally what Rashi's saying. He's saying you have to look at this verse and realize that it's begging interpretation. That's what our Rashi is saying. It's begging interpretation. K'moshe katvu Chazal, or k'moshe amru Chazal. Chazal are Chachmeinu Zichronam Livracha, meaning our sages of blessed memory. K'moshe amru, as our sages of blessed memory said. Here's another one. Bishvil HaTorah. That is that this word Bereshit is actually a code word, and the word be can mean in or with. Be can also mean with. And the word Reshit, as Rashi is going to explain, is a synonym for the Torah. In other words, Bishvil HaTorah shenikret, and he quotes Mishlei, which is Proverbs chapter 8, Reshit Darko, the beginning of his way, right? That the book of Proverbs, the verse actually goes that Hashem konani Reshit Darko, God established me as the basis of his ways, the beginning of his ways. And in the book of Proverbs, the Torah is personified. So it's as if the Torah is speaking about itself. So in other words, that God, created the world for the sake of the Torah. In other words, and again, this begs thought and meditation as to what he's saying here. In other words, that life itself, at least certainly human life, is dependent on the idea of studying, learning what God wants from us. And so it's dealing with the most fundamental question that I think a human being can ask, which is, why am I here? What purpose do I have as a human being in this, all the tools and blessings that are given to me, as well as the adversity? Why am I here? And the Torah is, God gave the Torah and created the world for the sake of the Torah, so that people would understand what their purpose was. So the Torah is a way of finding significance as human beings, given our mortality, given the brevity of our lives, given not only our abilities, but our lack of abilities, etc. The Torah is there. And were there no Torah, the world would not have been created. There are some beautiful literary ways of explaining this. One is that in Bereshit Rabbah, the Torah is seen as a blueprint. And just as an architect, before he actually builds anything, before you build the building, you write things down, you make plans, you do drawings, etc. You use the skills of architecture to design it. And so in a way, the Torah is the spiritual design, or sets forth the spiritual design of the universe. That's one way to understand it. Another similar, but from a different point of view, it's so interesting, by the way, that it says that God created many worlds before this world that we live in now. And the distinction is that the reason why those previous worlds came to an end is because there was no Torah in those worlds. And so think about it. Does this allow for the possibility of dinosaurs, etc.? What Torah do you think existed in the world that was of the dinosaur period, or the other periods of the development of the earth? So here we can see that even within our early texts, there's the notion that this isn't the only world, but that the reason for this current world has to do with the Torah, and the degree to which we consider the Torah as a basis. And I mentioned the last time that the Torah can refer to our 5 books and everything associated with it, but it can also have a broader context to say that, that other religions may have their Torahs as well. So another reason is Uvishvil Tzadikim, and that God created this world for the sake of the righteous. Shenikra'u, who are called, and this is in Jeremiah chapter 2, Reshit Tevu'ata, called the first of his produce. So that's where we're going to stop today, because we are going to get into a much more analytic explanation of this, and we'll deal with it, God willing, next Sunday. And but also there's much that could be thought about and reflected on for the sake of the righteous. And I will stop the share now and also stop the recording.